The Wyoming wind didn't just whisper, it screamed. And out here, in the dead of a February winter, a man had to scream back to survive. Garrett Walsh had been screaming back for 7 long years, carving out a life of solitude on a ranch so remote, his nearest neighbor was a 14-mile ride south. He preferred it that way. After the war, the quiet company of cattle felt more honest than the complicated noise of men. That morning was no different. He woke in the dark, the fire in his timber cabin down to glowing embers. He stoked it back to life, the wind rattling his shutters like a trapped spirit. Coffee boiled, strong and black, the only warmth he'd feel for hours. He was a man of routine, a man of preparation. Out here, routine kept you sane, and preparation kept you alive. He pulled on layers of wool and leather, his breath pluming in the frigid air as he stepped outside. The world was a sea of white, the snow falling so thick he could barely see the livestock shelter 20 yards away. He broke the ice on the water trough, his hands already aching with cold despite the thick gloves. He spread hay for the horses, their warm bodies steaming in the pre-dawn gloom. Then he turned to the cattle. They were huddled against the windbreak he'd built, dark shapes in a swirl of white. He counted them, a ritual he performed every morning, every night. 1, 2, 3. He paused. One heifer stood apart from the herd, near the tree line, unnaturally still. Garrett cursed under his breath. A stray was a problem, and problems in this weather could turn deadly fast. He trudged through the knee-deep snow, the wind trying to push him back with an invisible hand. Visibility was almost zero. He could hear the lowing of the heifer before he could properly see her. She was standing over something, a dark shape on the white snow. Probably a fallen branch, he thought, or a piece of canvas torn loose by the storm. He got closer. The shape moved. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Garrett's spine. It wasn't a branch. He broke into a clumsy run, snow filling his boots, his heart hammering against his ribs. He fell to his knees beside the shape, the cold soaking through his pants instantly. It was a person, a young woman, curled in a tight ball, her body racked with violent tremors. Her deerskin dress was beautiful, but it was no match for a Wyoming blizzard. Long black hair was fanned out against the snow like a spill of dark ink. Her skin, a beautiful bronze, had a sick, grayish tint. Frost clung to her eyelashes, to the corners of her mouth. She was unconscious, her breathing so shallow it was barely there. Another hour, maybe less, and she'd be gone. Garrett didn't think, he acted. He tore off his own heavy coat, the brutal cold hitting him like a physical blow, and wrapped it around her small frame. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing. He could feel the desperate, uncontrollable shivering of her body against his chest as he turned and fought his way back to the cabin, his mind a whirlwind of what he had to do next. The warmth of the cabin was a shock to his system. He kicked the door shut with his boot and carried her straight to his bed, the only one he had. Her clothes weren't just wet, they were frozen solid. He knew enough about the cold to know that leaving them on would kill her just as surely as the blizzard outside. With a grim sort of efficiency, he worked. He turned away, giving her what privacy he could in the single-room cabin, and removed the frozen deerskin. He dressed her in his own dry woolen shirt and pants, which swallowed her tiny frame. Then he piled every blanket he owned on top of her. He built the fire up until it roared, the heat becoming almost suffocating. Her shivering continued, a violent, rattling tremor. It was a good sign. It meant her body was still fighting. He heated water, careful not to make it too hot, and gently applied warm cloths to her hands and feet. The skin was discolored, an angry purple-gray, and he knew frostbite was a real danger. As he worked, he finally got a good look at her face. She was young, maybe 20. High cheekbones, a delicate jawline. There was a strength in her features, even in unconsciousness. He couldn't stop asking himself the same question, over and over. What was she doing out here? Alone. Dressed for a fall day, not a blizzard. Barefoot. The nearest native settlement was 40 miles away, an impossible journey in this weather. He found her barefoot. That one detail stuck in his mind. People don't lose their way and lose their shoes. People running for their lives lose their shoes. The thought sent another chill through him. If she was running from something, it might still be out there. As hours passed, her shivering slowly subsided. Her body was warming, but she didn't wake. He brewed a thin broth from dried beef, keeping it warm over the fire for when she did. He did his evening chores in a blur, his thoughts constantly returning to the woman in his bed. Darkness fell. The wind howled. He checked the bar on his door, a habit he hadn't broken from his time in the war. He checked the rifle propped against the wall. 7 years of peace hadn't erased the instinct that told him when something was wrong. And this was wrong. Near midnight, she opened her eyes. He saw it from his chair by the fire. A flicker of her eyelids, then a sudden sharp intake of breath. Her body went rigid under the blankets. Her eyes, wide and dark, darted around the unfamiliar cabin, taking in the log walls, the dying fire, the strange man sitting in the shadows. Fear. Pure, animal fear. She tried to sit up, a gasp escaping her lips as weakness pushed her back down. Her eyes locked on his. He saw the calculation in them, the rapid assessment of a threat. He raised a hand slowly, palm open. "You're safe," he said, his voice low and calm. "I found you in the snow. You were freezing to death." She just stared, her breathing coming in quick, shallow pants. He could practically see her mind working, mapping the room, noting the distance to the door, the rifle, him. He gestured to the pot over the fire. "I have broth, if you're hungry." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the crackling fire. Then, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but her English was clear, with only a slight accent. "Where am I?" "My ranch. About 15 miles north of Cottonwood Creek. I found you this morning." She absorbed this, her expression unreadable. "My feet." "Frostbite," he said gently. "I don't think it's severe, but you can't walk on them for a few days." She pulled a hand from under the blankets, examining her fingers in the firelight. They were still discolored. "You took my clothes." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "They were frozen. I gave you privacy." A flicker of something in her eyes. He couldn't tell what it was. She pulled the blankets tighter around herself. "I am called Aylin. My people are from the Northern Valley. Garrett Walsh." He stood and ladled some broth into a cup, moving slowly, deliberately. "That's a long way to come in the middle of winter, Aylin." He held the cup out to her. She hesitated for a second, then took it. Her hands trembled. "Why were you out there? Alone? In a storm?" Her jaw tightened. She looked away, staring into the flames. "I was being taken south. To the reservation. 4 soldiers. A guide. I escaped." The words landed in the quiet cabin like stones. Garrett knew about the forced relocations. He'd heard the stories. Some were orderly. Most were brutal. The look in Aylin's eyes told him which kind hers had been. "They'll come looking for you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "The storm covered your tracks. But when it clears, they will search," she finished for him. She met his gaze, and her eyes were hard, devoid of any hope. "You can collect the reward. $20 for an escaped native." The casual way she said it, the assumption of what he would do, hit him like a punch to the gut. It was colder than any winter wind. "I'm not interested in a reward." A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. "Then you will keep me. Use me. And when you are tired of me, you will sell me to the soldiers." Her voice was flat, empty, resigned. It was the sound of a person who had learned not to expect kindness from the world. He stood up abruptly, needing to put distance between them. "That is not going to happen." "Men always say things," she whispered, not looking at him. He wanted to argue, to tell her he was different. But he knew words were useless against a lifetime of experience. "You need to rest," he said instead. "We can talk about what happens next when you're stronger." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. Then she gave a single, slow nod and lay back down, turning to face the wall. It was a clear dismissal. Garrett sank back into his chair. The fire popped, casting long, dancing shadows. He thought about the soldiers. 4 of them, plus a guide, trained, armed, backed by the full authority of the United States government. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to wait for the storm to pass and take her to the authorities in Cottonwood Creek. No trouble for him. He could go back to his quiet life, but he couldn't get the image of her out of his head, curled up and dying in the snow. He couldn't forget the dead-end look in her eyes when she assumed the worst of him. For the first time in 7 years, Garrett Walsh felt his solitude not as peace, but as a cage he had built for himself. And he had just brought the outside world crashing through his door. Somewhere out there, armed men were waiting for the snow to stop so they could hunt this woman down. He looked at the rifle by the door. Then he looked at the small form huddled under the blankets on his bed. The choice was simple. And it wasn't a choice at all. He settled in for a long night, listening to the storm, and for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't entirely alone. The world was silent when he woke, the storm having finally blown itself out. The cabin was cold. He was stiff from sleeping in the chair. He built up the fire, moving quietly so as not to wake Eileen. She was sleeping deeply, color returned to her face. Outside, the landscape was transformed, buried under a thick blanket of new snow. It was beautiful, and it was deadly, and it had, for now, hidden them from the world. When he came back inside from his chores, she was awake. She was sitting up, watching him with those same guarded eyes. "How are the feet?" he asked. "They hurt." "Good," he said. "Pain means they're alive." He made cornmeal mush for them both, adding a little of his precious sugar to hers. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Less tense. "I was at Shiloh," he said suddenly, answering a question she hadn't asked. "Stone's River. I learned what cold does to a man." She just nodded, absorbing the information. He was telling her he could be trusted with her care. It was a start. "Tell me about your valley," he said. The question surprised her. "Why?" "Because it matters to you." For the first time, her expression softened. "It is green. The river is so clear you can count the stones on the bottom. My ancestors are buried in the caves on the mountainside. The land knows us." Her voice was filled with a longing so deep it was almost painful to hear. "And now they're taking it away." "They say we are needed for settlement," she said, bitterness creeping back into her voice. "What they mean is, they want what we have." "How did they take you?" he asked, his voice gentle. Her hands clenched around her bowl. "Soldiers came. They said we had to leave. My father, he is the chief. He tried to reason with them. They refused. A few days ago, they came back. They said the time was up. We had to go. Now. And you ran." A flash of fire in her dark eyes. "I fought. I wounded one of them. They said I was dangerous. An example needed to be made." Garrett felt his own jaw tighten. An example of what? She met his gaze, and her voice was steady, but filled with a cold fury he recognized from his own past. "The officer in charge, a Captain Marsh, he was going to break me, and then show me to my people when they arrived at the reservation, to show them the price of defiance." The rage that filled Garrett's chest was cold and sharp. This wasn't just about relocation anymore. This was about cruelty. About a man named Marsh who enjoyed his power. "You escaped in the storm." "The wind was loud. I had a piece of metal hidden. I cut my way out. I just ran." "You almost died." "Better to be free in the snow," she said, and he knew she meant it, "than alive in his cage." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the endless white. They would search. 5 men, well armed, with the law on their side. "I live alone for a reason," he said, turning to face her. "I don't like trouble. The smart thing would be for me to take you to the marshal in Cottonwood Creek." Her face remained a mask, but he saw the hope in her eyes flicker and die. "Yes," she said quietly. "That would be smart." A beat of silence. "But I'm not going to do that." Hope flared back to life in her eyes, so bright it startled him. "Why?" she whispered. He thought about it. He could talk about right and wrong, about decency. But it was simpler than that. He had made a choice when he lifted her out of the snow. A choice to interfere. "Because leaving you to die would have been one thing," he said slowly. "But saving you just to hand you over to men like that? I couldn't live with that." She searched his face, looking for the lie, for the hidden angle. She found none. A single nod. That was her thanks. "They will come," she said. "Captain Marsh? He will not give up easily. He will see you as an insult to his authority." "Then I'll have to be convincing when I tell him I've never seen you," Garrett said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been hanging in the air between them since she woke up. "What do you want from me?" He knew what she was really asking. What price he would demand for his protection. He met her gaze directly, holding it. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing you don't choose to give. You can stay here until you're healed. I'll give you supplies, a map. I'll help you get back to your people. The choice is yours." Her eyes glistened. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "Men don't just help," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "There is always a price." "Then consider me the exception," he said softly. "Time will prove it." She looked away, toward the fire, and he saw a storm of emotions on her face. When she finally looked back at him, she said two simple words. "Thank you." But those two words held the weight of a life saved, of hope restored. The cabin felt different after that. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding. For the first time in a long time, Garrett Walsh didn't feel so alone, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his life had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more meaningful. 3 days passed. A strange, quiet rhythm established itself in the small cabin. Garrett would tend to his chores, always scanning the horizon for riders. Aylin's feet began to heal, the angry color receding, the pain lessening. She was a quiet presence, but an observant one. She watched everything he did, asking sharp, intelligent questions. She learned the routines of the ranch with a speed that impressed him. On the 4th morning, he woke to find her standing by the window, her weight on both feet. She turned as he stirred, her face set with determination. "They are strong enough," she said. "I can travel." A strange tightness gripped Garrett's chest. "Where will you go?" "North, to my valley. If I can't find my people, I will follow them to the reservation." "That's 40 miles of mountains in the dead of winter," he said. "It's suicide." "Staying here puts you in more danger every day," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Captain Marsh is looking for me. He won't stop." She was right. But the thought of her leaving, of this small cabin returning to its empty silence, was something he found he couldn't bear. "The risk is mine," he said. "You owe me nothing." "I owe you my life," she said, stepping closer to him. "I will not repay that debt by getting you killed." He saw the resolve in her eyes. She was leaving. "Then wait," he said. 2 more days. Let your feet heal completely. I'll pack you supplies. The best winter gear I have. I won't send you out there unprepared." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. 2 days. The decision hung in the air between them. Their time was now measured in hours. That afternoon, while she sat by the fire, mending her deerskin dress, she asked him a question that no one had asked him in years. "Tell me about before the war." He paused, surprised. He told her about Virginia, about his father, the merchant, about his dreams of studying books. "I was 19, he said, the ghost of a humorless laugh in his voice. "I thought it would be a grand adventure. Then I went to Shiloh." "What happened at Shiloh?" she asked softly. 2 days of hell, he said, his voice flat. I watched friends die for reasons that made less and less sense with every cannon blast. By the end, I knew war wasn't about glory. It was just waste. Yet you kept fighting. What else was there to do? I couldn't go home. I couldn't pretend to be the boy who left. So I came west, looking for a place quiet enough to forget. He gestured around the cabin. And I found this. Has it been enough? She asked, her perception cutting right to the heart of him. He looked at her, at the firelight dancing in her dark eyes, and for the first time in 7 years, he told the truth. I thought it was, he said. Until you. The admission hung in the air, a confession that changed everything. She didn't respond, just returned to her sewing. But he saw the small, secret smile on her lips. That evening, as he came in from the final check on the livestock, he found her standing by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. I have been thinking, she said, not turning around. Perhaps I should wait until spring. His heart leaped. It would be safer, he managed to say, keeping his voice even. My people will be at the reservation by then, she said, turning to face him. I would know where to find them. But it means staying here. It means putting you in danger for months. You're not asking, he said, stepping closer. I'm offering. Why? She asked, her voice a whisper. Why risk so much for a stranger? You're not a stranger anymore, Aelin, he said, his own voice dropping. And the risk, it feels worth taking. For what? What do you gain? He looked at her, and the answer was so simple, so obvious. Your company, he said. I've been alone for so long, I forgot what it felt like not to be. Her breath hitched. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she placed it on his. It was the first time she had touched him willingly. Her skin was warm. You are a strange man, Garrett Walsh. Maybe, he said. Or maybe I'm just tired of being alone. They stood there for a long time, her hand on his, the fire crackling beside them, the winter world sealed away outside the cabin walls. A decision had been made. She was staying. And in that moment, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, Garrett felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since before the war. It was fragile, he knew. It was temporary. But for now, it was enough. The decision for Aelin to stay until spring changed the air in the cabin. The temporary shelter became a home. They fell into a new routine, one of shared chores and quiet companionship. He taught her how to mend fences and predict the weather from the clouds. She taught him how to read the tracks of animals in the snow, how to find edible roots even under the frozen ground. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts, of the people they had lost. He found himself opening up in ways he never thought he would again, the hard shell he had built around his heart beginning to crack. He learned the cadence of her speech, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of her valley, the quiet strength that radiated from her. He was falling for her. He knew it was a fool's errand. She was bound to her people, to a life he could never be a part of. And he was a man hiding from his past, tied to this piece of land. But knowing the end didn't change the journey. Each day was a gift, a small pocket of warmth in the middle of a long, cold winter. The attraction between them was a current running just beneath the surface, present in lingering glances, in hands that brushed against each other as they worked. They both felt it, and they both knew that acting on it would only make the inevitable goodbye that much harder. Then, one afternoon, 15 days after he'd found her, everything changed. He was splitting firewood when he heard it. The distinct sound of multiple horses moving through the deep snow. His blood ran cold. He put down the axe and moved to the edge of the trees, peering out. 5 riders, military coats, an organized formation. It was Captain Marsh. He walked back to the cabin, his face a calm mask, but his heart was a drum against his ribs. Aelin looked up as he entered, and she knew instantly. They are here. She was already on her feet, grabbing her mended dress, her eyes wide with a familiar fear. Wait, he said, grabbing her arm gently. You can't run. They'll see your tracks. Trust me. He pulled open the trapdoor to the small root cellar. Get in. There's a space behind the shelves. Hide, and do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. Be careful, Garrett, she whispered. He is a dangerous man. I know. He closed the door over her, kicked some dirt over the edges and walked back outside to his woodpile, picking up the axe just as the riders emerged from the trees. The man in the lead was tall, with a face like a hawk and cold, calculating eyes. Captain Marsh. Good morning, Marsh called out, his tone deceptively pleasant. Name's Garrett Walsh, Garrett said, leaning on his axe. Can I help you? Captain Thomas Marsh, U.S. Army. We're looking for an escaped fugitive, a native woman. Seen anyone? Not a soul, Garrett said, shaking his head. Haven't seen anyone but my cattle for months. A woman wouldn't last a day out here in this cold. Marsh's eyes narrowed. My men and I have been tracking her for 2 weeks. The trail went cold in the blizzard, but our search grid puts your ranch right in the middle of where she could have reached. Well, she didn't reach here, Garrett said, shrugging. But you're welcome to look around. Marsh dismounted, along with a sergeant. We will. Garrett led them into the cabin. His heart pounded as Marsh's eyes swept over everything. The single set of dishes, the pallet on the floor, the extra blankets piled on the bed. Marsh walked over to the bed and ran a hand over the blankets. You sleep on the floor? Bad back, Garrett lied smoothly. Bed's too soft. Marsh didn't look convinced. He continued his slow, methodical search of the small room, his eyes missing nothing. The sergeant checked the outbuildings. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Below the floorboards, Aylin was holding her breath, listening to the footsteps of the men who were hunting her. Finally, the sergeant returned. Nothing, sir. Barn and shed are clear. Marsh turned his cold gaze back to Garrett. You served, didn't you, Mr. Walsh? Army of the Potomac? Garrett was taken aback. How did you know? The way you stand. The way you hold yourself. You're a soldier, which means you understand the importance of following orders. Harboring a fugitive is a federal crime. I'm aware of that, Captain, Garrett said, his voice level. But I can't help you find someone I've never seen. Marsh stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. I don't believe you, Mr. Walsh. I think you found her. I think you're hiding her. And I will find her. Just then, the sergeant, who had stepped back outside, called out, Captain, there's a root cellar back here. Garrett's blood turned to ice. It's frozen shut, he said quickly. Haven't been in there all winter. Open it, Marsh commanded. The sound of the sergeant wrenching the frozen cellar door open was the loudest thing Garrett had ever heard. He heard the footsteps on the wooden stairs. He imagined the lantern light sweeping across the shelves, illuminating the dark corners. He held his breath. It was over. The sergeant reappeared at the cabin door, stamping snow from his boots. Just supplies, sir. Nothing else. Relief washed over Garrett so intensely he felt lightheaded. Marsh stared at him for a long, hard moment. He knew Garrett was lying. He just couldn't prove it. We'll be back, Mr. Walsh, Marsh said, his voice a low promise. And when we find her, I'm coming back for you. Garrett watched them ride away, disappearing back into the trees. He waited a full 10 minutes before he opened the cellar door. Aylin emerged, pale but safe. She flew into his arms, trembling. That was too close, she whispered into his chest. He knows, Garrett said, holding her tight. He'll be back. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear, gratitude, and something else, something deeper. You risked everything for me, she said. Why? He looked down at her, and the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled to dust. Because, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Somewhere along the way, your life became more important than my own. He leaned down and kissed her. It was a kiss born of fear and relief, of shared danger, and a connection that had grown in the silent, isolated cabin. When they broke apart, the world had shifted. They were no longer just a man and a woman hiding from the law. They were two people bound together, facing a dangerous world. And they knew, with a terrifying certainty, that Captain Marsh would be back, And next time, he wouldn't be leaving without a fight. The kiss changed everything. The unspoken tension that had simmered between them for weeks finally broke, replaced by a fierce, protective intimacy. They were no longer just allies in a dangerous situation. They were something more, something neither of them had a name for yet. But the shadow of Captain Marsh loomed over them. They knew he hadn't given up. His threat to return wasn't idle. For the next few weeks, they lived on a knife's edge. Garrett spent his days fortifying the ranch, reinforcing doors, planning escape routes. His wartime instincts, long dormant, came roaring back to life. He taught Aylin how to shoot the rifle, her steady hand and keen eye impressing him. They were a team now, their every action bent towards a single purpose: survival. They knew they couldn't stay at the ranch forever. Marsh would be back, and likely with more men. Their plan was simple and desperate. They would wait for the first signs of spring thaw, then make a break for it, heading north into the treacherous Wind River Range, hoping to lose themselves in the vast, untamed wilderness. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, trapping them in the warm, fire-lit cabin, Aylin grew quiet. She was looking into the flames, her face troubled. "What is it?" Garrett asked, sitting beside her. "Captain Marsh," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "There is something I did not tell you." A cold knot of dread formed in Garrett's stomach. "What is it, Aylin?" "The soldier I wounded," she said, her eyes meeting his. "When I escaped, I did not just wound him." She took a shaky breath. "He tried to stop me. He grabbed me. I fought back. He fell, and his head struck a rock. I did not know if he was... I just ran." Garrett's mind reeled. This changed everything. If that soldier had died, Aylin wasn't just a fugitive. In the eyes of the law, she was a murderer. Marsh wasn't just hunting an escaped prisoner. He was hunting a killer. His obsession, his cruelty, it all made a terrible kind of sense now. "This changes nothing between us," Garrett said firmly, taking her hand. "You were defending yourself." "But it changes everything for him," she said, her voice filled with despair. "He will not stop. Ever." They were no longer just waiting for Marsh to return. They were waiting for a man seeking vengeance. The days grew longer, the sun a little warmer. The snow began to melt, turning the world into a sea of mud and slush. It was almost time. They packed their meager supplies, ready to leave at a moment's notice. The fragile peace they had built was gone, replaced by a constant gnawing anxiety. Then, one evening, it happened. Garrett was in the barn, tending to the horses, when he heard a noise. Not horses this time. A single sharp crack, like a branch snapping. But it wasn't a branch. It was a rifle shot. He dropped to the ground, his heart pounding, as a second shot splintered the wood of the barn door, inches from his head. He crawled to a crack in the wall and peered out. In the fading light, he could see them. Not soldiers this time. Rough-looking men in civilian clothes, at least 4 of them, spread out, using the trees for cover. Bounty hunters. Marsh had given up on doing the job himself. He had outsourced it. Garrett scrambled back from the wall, his mind racing. Aylin was in the cabin, alone. He had to get to her. He took a deep breath, grabbed a pitchfork, and burst out of the barn, screaming a war cry he hadn't used since Shiloh. He ran zigzag, a desperate, chaotic sprint towards the cabin. A rifle barked, and he felt a searing pain in his left shoulder. He stumbled, but didn't fall. He kept running, fueled by adrenaline and fear. He burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind him and barring it. Aylin was there, the rifle in her hands, her face pale but determined. "Bounty hunters!" he gasped, clutching his bleeding shoulder. 4 of them! She was at his side instantly, tearing a strip of cloth from her dress to staunch the bleeding. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice calm and steady. "They'll burn us out." She was right. He looked around the small cabin that had been their sanctuary, their world. It was about to become their tomb. "The cellar," he said. "There's a small ventilation shaft on the far wall. It leads out to the creek bed. It's small, but we might be able to squeeze through." It was a desperate gamble. The shaft was barely big enough for a child. But it was their only chance. Outside, the bounty hunters were shouting, their voices rough and impatient. "Walsh, we know you're in there. Send out the girl, and we'll let you live." Garrett knew it was a lie. They were here to collect a bounty, and dead or alive, it paid the same. He looked at Aylin. Her eyes were filled with a fierce resolve that mirrored his own. They were in this together. To the end. He grabbed his own rifle, and together, they descended into the cold, dark cellar, pulling the heavy door closed behind them. The final siege had begun. The cellar was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and dried herbs. Above them, they could hear the heavy boots of the bounty hunters stomping through the cabin, the sound of furniture being overturned, glass shattering. They were tearing the place apart. Garrett led Aylin to the back wall, his shoulder throbbing with a dull, insistent pain. He felt for the loose stones he knew were there, his fingers fumbling in the darkness. He pulled them away, revealing a small, dark opening. The ventilation shaft. It was even smaller than he remembered. A cold draft whispered out of it. "You first," he said to Aylin. "It's going to be a tight squeeze." She looked from the small opening to his face, her eyes wide in the gloom. "We go together, or not at all," she said. "Aylin, there's no time to argue. I will not leave you." Before he could protest, she ripped another strip of cloth from her dress and began to bind his wounded shoulder, her movements quick and efficient. The pressure was excruciating, but it slowed the bleeding. Above them, a new sound. A crackling, roaring noise. And a smell. Smoke. "They've set the cabin on fire," Garrett said, his voice grim. The heat was already beginning to seep through the floorboards. They had minutes, maybe less. "Go," he urged Aylin. "Now. I'll be right behind you." She gave him one last look, then turned and began to wriggle her way into the narrow shaft. Garrett followed, the rough stone scraping against his back, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. It was a slow, agonizing process. The shaft was filled with dirt and roots, and twice he thought he was stuck. But the thought of Aylin, of the fire raging above them, pushed him forward. He could hear her ahead of him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He could smell the fresh, cold night air. They were almost there. He burst out of the shaft, tumbling down a short, steep embankment into the icy water of the creek bed. Aylin was there waiting for him, pulling him to his feet. Behind them, the sky was a hellish orange. The cabin, their home, was an inferno. They didn't look back. They scrambled up the far side of the creek bed and plunged into the dark woods, the shouts of the bounty hunters fading behind them. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, collapsing in a heap in a small, hidden hollow. They were alive. They were free. But they had nothing. No food, no shelter, no supplies. Just the clothes on their backs, 2 rifles, and a handful of cartridges. And they were being hunted. Garrett looked at Aylin, her face illuminated by the distant dying glow of their burning home. She wasn't crying. Her face was set, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire that matched the one that had just consumed their lives. "What now, Garrett Walsh?" she asked, her voice steady. He looked north, towards the dark, looming shapes of the Wind River Mountains. It was their only hope. "Now," he said, getting to his feet and pulling her up with him. "We disappear." Their journey was a brutal ordeal. They moved by night, resting during the day, eating whatever they could find. Roots, bark, the occasional rabbit Aylin managed to snare. Garrett's wound festered, and he grew weak with fever. There were times when he was sure he couldn't take another step, but Aylin's strength, her unwavering resolve, kept him going. She was at home in the wilderness in a way he never could be. She read the land like a book, finding shelter, finding water, always pushing them forward. In their shared hardship, their bond deepened into something unbreakable. They were no longer 2 separate people. They were a single unit, surviving against impossible odds. One evening, huddled together for warmth under a rocky outcropping, they saw a campfire in the distance. They approached cautiously, their rifles ready. It was a single man, an old trapper, his face as weathered as the mountains around him. He shared his fire and his food with them, asking no questions. He had seen the smoke from the burning ranch days ago. "Bounty hunters," he grunted, spitting into the fire. Scum of the earth. Heard they was hired by some army captain. A real piece of work, from what I hear. He told them that Marsh and his soldiers were still in the area, combing the mountains, convinced that Aylin and Garrett were still hiding nearby. But he also told them something else. News had trickled in from the south. Aylin's people had been moved to the reservation. But they weren't broken. Her father, the chief, was already fighting back, using his words, using the law, to protest their treatment. They hadn't been defeated. They had just moved the battlefield. Hope, fierce and bright, flared in Aylin's chest. Her father was alive. Her people were fighting. She had to get to them. The old trapper gave them what supplies he could spare, and a hand-drawn map. The soldiers are watching the main passes, he said. But there's an old goat trail higher up. It's dangerous. But they won't be looking for you there. It was a sliver of a chance, but it was all they had. They thanked the old man and set off again, their spirits renewed. The goat trail was a nightmare, a narrow ledge clinging to the side of a mountain, with a sheer drop of 1,000 feet on one side. But they pushed on, driven by the hope of reaching the reservation, of finding Aylin's family. Finally, after weeks of travel that felt like a lifetime, they came down out of the mountains. In the distance, they could see the bleak, orderly lines of the reservation. They had made it. But as they approached, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A group of riders, kicking up dust as they galloped towards the reservation entrance. At the head of the group was a tall man in a captain's uniform. It was Marsh. He had anticipated their move. He wasn't searching the mountains anymore. He was waiting for them. They were trapped. The open plains offered no cover, no place to hide. Marsh and his men were bearing down on them. This was it. The final confrontation. There was nowhere left to run. "This is my fight, Garrett," Aylin said, turning to him, her eyes blazing. "You've done enough. Go. Save yourself." "I'm not leaving you," he said, chambering a round in his rifle. "Not now. Not ever." He looked at her, at the woman he had pulled from the snow, the woman who had saved him in 1,000 different ways. He loved her. He knew that now, with a certainty that eclipsed everything else. "Whatever happens," he said, "we face it together." She nodded, a small, sad smile on her lips. They stood side by side, two lone figures against the vast Wyoming sky, and raised their rifles as the soldiers charged. The battle was short and brutal. Garrett and Aylin were skilled, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. They took down 2 of the soldiers before a bullet grazed Garrett's temple, sending him sprawling into darkness. He woke to the feel of rough hands dragging him to his feet. His head was spinning, his vision blurry. He saw Aylin, standing proud and defiant, her hands bound, her face bruised but unbroken. And he saw Captain Marsh, a triumphant, cruel smile on his face. "I told you I'd find you," Marsh sneered. "And now you'll both get what you deserve. She'll hang for murder, and you'll rot in a military prison for treason." They were marched to the reservation where Aylin's people were gathered, their faces a mixture of fear and fury. He saw an older man, his face a mask of grief, who must have been Aylin's father. Marsh made a show of their capture, parading them through the camp, relishing his victory. They were thrown into a makeshift cell, a small, windowless shack, to await their fate. The future looked bleak, a dead end. But as they sat in the darkness, Aylin reached for Garrett's hand. "We are not dead yet," she whispered, her voice filled with a strength that defied their situation. And in the darkness, Garrett felt a flicker of hope. She was right. As long as they were together, as long as they were breathing, the fight wasn't over. They had faced down blizzards and bounty hunters, mountains and starvation. They would face this too, together. They spent 2 days locked in the darkness, with nothing but stale water and hardtack. But they weren't idle. Aylin, using the languages her mother had taught her were bridges, spoke through the cracks in the wall to the guards, to the people who brought their food. She learned that her father was meeting with a territorial judge who had come to investigate the claims of mistreatment. She learned that the soldier she had fought with had not died immediately, but had lingered for a week, and in a moment of clarity before his death, had confessed to his bunkmate that he had attacked her, that her actions were in self-defense. The bunkmate, a young private racked with guilt, was terrified of Marsh, but was considering telling the judge the truth. It was a slim chance, a thread of hope in a sea of despair. On the third day they were dragged from their cell. Marsh was taking them to be formally charged by the judge. As they were marched across the compound, Aylin's father stepped forward, blocking their path. He was a man of immense dignity and presence, and even Marsh seemed taken aback. "You will not take my daughter," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "She will have a trial, a fair one." Marsh laughed. "She is a murderer. Her trial is a formality. Now get out of my way, old man." But her father didn't move, and behind him, the other members of the tribe began to gather, silent, watchful. A young soldier, his face pale and sweating, pushed his way through the crowd. It was the private, the dead soldier's friend. "Captain," he stammered, I have to speak to the judge." Marsh's face turned thunderous. "You will be silent, private!" But it was too late. A man in civilian clothes, the judge, stepped forward. "Let the boy speak," he said, his voice calm but firm. The private, his voice trembling, told his story. He told the judge what his friend had confessed. He told them that Marsh had ordered them all to lie about what happened, to paint Aylin as a cold-blooded killer. The crowd erupted. Aylin's people, who had been simmering with resentment for weeks, now had a focus for their anger. The other soldiers, who had been cowed by Marsh, now saw an opportunity to escape his tyranny. The situation was a powder keg, and the private's confession was the match. The judge, seeing the truth in the young soldier's eyes, and seeing the potential for a riot, made a decision. "Captain Marsh," he said, his voice cold, "you are relieved of your command. You are under arrest for obstruction of justice and witness tampering." Marsh was stunned. He reached for his pistol, but before he could draw it, he was swarmed by his own men, eager to prove their loyalty to the new chain of command. In the chaos, Aylin's father unlocked her bonds. She was free. She ran to Garrett, and they held each other, the cheers of her people washing over them. It was over. Justice, swift and unexpected, had prevailed. In the weeks that followed, Aylin was officially exonerated. The government, embarrassed by the scandal, made concessions to her people, promising them better land, more autonomy. Aylin, with her knowledge of English and her fierce intelligence, became a crucial leader, a bridge between her world and the world outside. Garrett stayed. He helped rebuild, his skills as a rancher proving invaluable. He found a new purpose, a new home. He was no longer a man running from his past, but a man building a future. One evening, months later, he and Aylin stood on a hill overlooking the valley her people now called home. It was beautiful, just as she had described it, green and full of life. "My mother used to say that languages are bridges," Aylin said, taking his hand. "That the more you build, the more places you can go." He looked at her, at the woman he loved, and knew he had finally found the place he was meant to be. "I think love is a bridge too," he said. She smiled, the same smile he had seen in the firelight of the cabin all those months ago. "It is," she said. "It's the one that brought you home." They had found each other in the middle of a storm, two broken people from different worlds. They had fought for their lives, for their freedom, for a future that seemed impossible. Their story was a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of winters, hope can survive. That courage can be found in the most unlikely of places, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones you find when you're lost in the snow. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected.